At ZO-200 on April 27, 1865, 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, the steamboat SS Sultana carried 2,427 souls through darkness on the Mississippi River. The war had ended 18 days earlier. On the decks below, packed shoulder to shoulder, 1,960 Union soldiers slept in the spring night air. They were going home. Most had survived Andersonville and Cahaba, Confederate prison camps, where men starved, where disease killed more than bullets ever did. They'd been exchanged, processed through Vicksburg, promised passage north to Cairo, Illinois, then trains to Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, home. After years of hell, home was 4 days away. The Sultana's legal capacity was 376 passengers. She carried more than 6 times that number. Captain J. Cass Mason knew the risks. He'd accepted $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer, from the U.S. government to transport these soldiers north. At those rates, this single voyage would earn him over $10,000, more than most men made in 5 years. He'd repaired a leaking boiler in Vicksburg with a temporary patch. The chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, had recommended pulling the boiler entirely, replacing the damaged section properly. That would take 3 days. Mason couldn't afford 3 days. Another steamboat, the Henry Ames, waited in Vicksburg for overflow passengers. If Mason delayed, he'd lose half his cargo and half his fortune. He ordered the patch welded on, the Sultana loaded, and the departure scheduled for April 24th. The patch held through Vicksburg. It held through Helena, Arkansas, where the Sultana stopped to offload 120 hogsheads of sugar on April 26th. It held as the ship steamed north through the night, 4 massive boilers burning coal, generating steam pressure to drive the twin paddle wheels that pushed 1,619 tons of steamboat against the Mississippi current. The soldiers packed every available space. The main deck, designed for cargo, held men standing in shifts because there wasn't room to lie down. The cabin deck above held officers and civilians in staterooms designed for 30, now housing 200. The hurricane deck, the open-air promenade meant for leisurely river watching, served as sleeping quarters for hundreds more. Men climbed the twin smokestacks to escape the crush below, wrapping arms around the hot metal, sleeping sitting up. Among them, Private Chester Berry, 20th Michigan Infantry, age 19, captured at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads 11 months earlier. Private William Luganbeal, 102nd Ohio Infantry, who'd lost 47 pounds at Andersonville, whose brother died there of dysentery. Sergeant John L. Walker, 64th Ohio, who kept a diary he planned to show his wife when he reached home in 6 days. The Sultana's boilers operated at pressures approaching the design maximum, 145 pounds per square inch. Each boiler measured 24 feet long, 46 inches in diameter, constructed from quarter-inch iron plate. When properly maintained, when not overworked, when not patched with temporary repairs, they were safe. The patch on the middle larboard boiler was not safe. The chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, monitored the gauges through the night. Pressure remained stable. The patch showed no visible stress. The engines drove steady power to the paddle wheels, maintaining 8 miles per hour against the current, swollen from spring floods that added 3 miles per hour to the river's southern flow. At 0200, the Sultana passed Memphis, her lights visible from shore, her decks silent except for the rhythmic splash of paddle wheels and the constant low rumble of the boilers. In 4 more hours, she would reach Cairo. The soldiers would board trains. By week's end, Chester Berry would see Michigan, William Luganbeal would reach Ohio, John Walker would embrace his wife. At 0203, the patched boiler failed. The explosion occurred in the starboard boiler room, where steam pressure of 145 pounds per square inch found release through the weakened metal. When a steamboat boiler explodes, the failure isn't gradual. The patch didn't peel slowly or leak incrementally. It ruptured completely in a fraction of a second. The initial blast tore through the ship's superstructure like a cannon shot. The 3 remaining boilers, suddenly relieved of back pressure from the failed unit, overloaded instantly and detonated in sequence. 4 boilers, releasing their energy simultaneously. The equivalent of several tons of gunpowder igniting at once. The explosion vaporized the entire center section of the Sultana. from the waterline to 20 feet above the hurricane deck. The twin smokestacks, each weighing several tons, launched upward like artillery shells, arced through the darkness, crashed down into the Mississippi 50 yards from the ship. The paddle wheel housings disintegrated, deck planking transformed into thousands of wooden projectiles traveling at lethal velocity. Men sleeping near the boilers died instantly, vaporized by the steam or killed by the concussive force. Men on the decks above fell through the sudden void where the center of the ship had existed seconds before, dropped 3 stories into water and wreckage and superheated steam that scalded on contact. The sound carried to Memphis, 7 miles south. Residents reported hearing what they thought was artillery, impossible because the war had ended. But the sound was unmistakable. At the Union garrison, soldiers assumed a magazine had exploded. No one yet understood that the sound came from a steamboat, that nearly 2,000 men were dying in the river. On the Sultana, the forward and aft sections remained partially intact, but fire spread immediately. The coal that fed the boilers scattered across the wreckage, still burning. Wood decking, dried by years of sun and coated with paint and oil, ignited. Within minutes, flames consumed both ends of the shattered vessel. Soldiers jumped into the Mississippi in darkness. The river temperature was 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia in 20 minutes. Many had no chance to remove their boots or heavy wool uniforms, which absorbed water, pulled them under. Those who'd survived prison camps by starving weighed 90 pounds, lacked the strength to swim even without sodden clothing. Private Chester Berry found himself in the water with no memory of jumping. The explosion had thrown him clear. He grabbed a piece of decking, kicked toward shore, couldn't see land in any direction. Around him, men screamed, went silent, sank. The current pulled south, away from Memphis, away from help. The fire on the Sultana grew hotter. Men trapped on the intact portions faced an impossible choice: burn or jump into water that would kill them just as certainly. Hundreds chose the water. The Mississippi swallowed most of them. Within minutes, Private William Luganbeal survived the initial explosion but found himself pinned under fallen timber on the hurricane deck as fire approached. Other soldiers pulled him free, threw him over the railing into the river. He couldn't swim. A piece of wooden door floated past. He grabbed it, held on, drifted south with the current and the bodies. The few lifeboats the Sultana carried had been destroyed in the explosion or burned in the fire. Soldiers constructed makeshift rafts from doors, planking, anything that floated. They clung to bales of hay that had been stored on the main deck for the ship's mules. Though the hay absorbed water and sank within an hour. Help came slowly. The steamboat Bostoner, southbound from Cairo, spotted the burning Sultana at 02:30 and altered course, plucking survivors from the water. The gunboat USS Tyler, moored at Memphis, received word of the disaster at 02:45 and steamed north, arriving in the debris field at 03:20. By then, most of those who'd entered the water had already drowned or died of hypothermia. The Sultana burned until 0900, when the hull finally broke apart and sank in 15 feet of water near Mound City, Arkansas. Portions of the wreckage remained visible above the waterline for weeks, a skeletal reminder jutting from the Mississippi's surface. The casualty count proved impossible to determine precisely. The ship's manifest listed 1,260 soldiers, but unofficial records suggest more may have boarded at Vicksburg. Civilian passengers numbered between 80 and 100. Crew totaled 85. The official death toll settled at 1,092, but survivors' accounts and analysis of prison camp rosters indicate the true number approached 1,800. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. More Americans died on the Sultana than on the Titanic 67 years later. More died than in the explosion of the USS Maine that triggered the Spanish-American War. More died than in any submarine disaster, any ferry sinking, any naval engagement in American waters. Yet within days, the story vanished from newspapers. On April 14th, 2 weeks before the Sultana exploded, John Wilkes Booth had assassinated President Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The nation remained consumed by that tragedy, by the manhunt for Booth and his conspirators, by Lincoln's funeral train that crossed the country, carrying his body home to Springfield. On April 26th, the day before the Sultana disaster, Union soldiers cornered Booth in a Virginia tobacco barn and killed him. The Sultana explosion occurred the following morning. Newspapers that might have dedicated front pages to 1-800 dead soldiers instead buried the story on page 4, page 8, sometimes not at all. The New York Times ran a single paragraph. Harper's Weekly, which had extensively covered naval disasters during the war, published nothing. The Army convened an investigation. The lead investigator, Captain Frederick Speed, determined that the disaster resulted from criminal negligence. The overloading of passengers, the inadequate boiler repair, the pressure to depart Vicksburg, despite known mechanical deficiencies. He recommended court-martial for multiple officers involved in authorizing the transport contract. No one was ever prosecuted. Captain Mason died in the explosion. The officers who'd approved the contract claimed they were following orders to expedite soldier transport home. The steamboat company's owners declared bankruptcy. The investigation file was marked complete and archived. Private Chester Berry reached shore 4 miles south of Memphis after spending 6 hours in the water. He survived. He returned to Michigan, married, lived until 1922. He wrote a memoir titled Loss of the Sultana, one of the few detailed accounts published. Private William Luganbeal reached shore clinging to his wooden door. He survived. He returned to Ohio, where he lived until 1918, 53 years after the disaster. He spoke rarely of that night. Sergeant John L. Walker's body was recovered 3 weeks later, identified by the diary in his pocket. The final entry, written April 26th, read, "Another day closer to home." Of the 2,127 people aboard the Sultana when she departed Vicksburg, approximately 600 survived. Most were pulled from the water by rescue boats in the first hour after the explosion. A few reached shore through extraordinary effort and improbable luck. Some were found downriver days later, clinging to debris, more dead than alive, saved by chance encounters with passing steamboats. The wreckage of the Sultana rested in the Mississippi for decades, gradually buried by silt as the river shifted its course. In the 1980s, archaeologists located what they believed to be the remains, not in the river channel, but under a soybean field in Arkansas, 2 miles from the current riverbank. The Mississippi had changed course over 120 years, leaving the Sultana's grave on dry land. No major monument marks the disaster site. No national memorial commemorates the 1,800 dead. In Memphis, a small historical marker stands near the river. In Vicksburg, another marker notes where the soldiers boarded. The dead were buried in the Memphis National Cemetery, in mass graves, most unidentified. The SS Sultana carried men who'd survived Shiloh, Vicksburg, Atlanta. Men who'd endured Andersonville and Cahaba, where the death rate exceeded 50%. Men who'd survived the Civil War itself, 4 years of industrial-scale killing that left 750,000 Americans dead. They died going home. On a river, in peacetime, 18 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. They died because a captain wanted profit, because an engineer's warning was ignored, because a temporary patch failed, because 2,400 people were loaded onto a boat designed for 376. The Sultana disaster killed more Americans than died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. More than died in the Battle of the Alamo. More than died when the USS Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine in World War II. It killed more than any other maritime disaster in U.S. history, before or since, and it was forgotten almost immediately, buried under the weight of Lincoln's death, lost in the chaos of a nation trying to rebuild itself after 4 years of civil war. On the morning of April 27, 1865, the sun rose over the Mississippi River. The water flowed south, as it always had, as it always would. Pieces of wreckage drifted past Memphis, bodies floated in the current. The war was over, the men were going home. They almost made it.